Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity finds its calm and the ancient world drifts softly back to life. Tonight we'll travel far beyond the hum of modern cities and electric clocks, back to a place where the first empires rose from river mud and vanished again into silence. This is the story of Agade, once called Akkad, the city that tried to rule the world, and the curse that erased it from memory for thousands of years. Some called it the heart of Sumer, others its undoing, but all agreed on one thing. When Agade fell, something shifted in the balance between humans and gods, as if the heavens themselves had turned their gaze away. Before we begin, take a moment. Let the day slip off your shoulders. Maybe you're lying down somewhere warm, or sitting with a quiet drink nearby. Maybe the night is still young where you are. Wherever you happen to be listening from, thank you for being here. You're part of this small circle of calm that looks at the past not as dust and ruins, but as something alive. If you find this gentle wander through history soothing, I'd be grateful if you left a like, maybe subscribed, or simply stayed a little longer. It helps this quiet corner reach others who might also need a slower kind of story tonight. The name Agade appears in ancient tablets like a whisper from before history had edges. For centuries, even scholars doubted it was real. They searched the plains of Mesopotamia for its traces, but the city refused to be found. Only fragments spoke its name: the Curse of Agade, the lamentations of its fall, the lists of kings who once ruled it, all clues to something magnificent and terrible that had disappeared. The tale begins not in ruin, but in glory with Sargon, the man who founded the Akkadian Empire around 2300 BCE. He rose from obscurity, perhaps even from servitude, to build the first true empire the world had seen. His capital, Agade, became a city of wonders, its walls lined with silver and its storehouses overflowing with grain. From there, Sargon ruled lands that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, a feat that must have seemed almost divine. But empires have memories, and they also have shadows. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, would inherit both. The story of the curse doesn't begin with the city's rise. It begins with its pride. The text known as the Curse of Agade was written long after the events it describes, but it feels like a voice echoing from the heart of disaster. It tells how Naram-Sin angered the gods by attacking a sacred mountain, the seat of Enlil, the chief deity of Sumer. The gods, in response, withdrew their favour, sending famine, rebellion and ruin upon his once flourishing city. To later generations, this became a warning. When kings forget their limits, even the divine can turn away. To modern eyes, it reads almost like an ancient reflection on power, ambition, and the fragility of civilization. But before it became myth, it may have been memory, an account of real events, recorded by scribes who watched their world collapse. Imagine it. Agade at its height. The streets lined with merchants speaking dozens of tongues, baskets of dates and barley traded beside shining copper from the mountains. The temples stood high, each one a step closer to heaven. In the heat of day, the air shimmered above courtyards where priests read omens from oil and smoke. The Euphrates and Tigris, twin arteries of life, carried barges heavy with goods from far-off lands. For a moment in time, this city believed itself untouchable. And then something began to shift. Perhaps it started with the skies. A drought here, a failed harvest there. Perhaps the river ran lower one season, or the winds brought more dust than rain. At first, people might have called it a test, not a curse. But as the years dragged on, the pattern deepened into fear. When the gods of Mesopotamia were silent, it wasn't simply absence. It meant the balance between heaven and earth had broken. The gods didn't just live in temples, they lived in the daily rhythm of life. They filled the granaries, blessed the fields, and guided the scribes' hands as they wrote. If those gods turned away, Then every part of existence began to unravel. That's what the Curse of Agade describes. Not only punishment, but disconnection. A world once aligned, now thrown out of tune. The city that had claimed to rule the world suddenly found itself alone, its prayers unanswered. The myth says Naram-Sin had gone too far, calling himself divine, breaking the walls of a sacred sanctuary. The priests begged him to stop, but pride, as myths remind us, has a gravity of its own. What's fascinating is that somewhere behind this story lies history. Modern researchers have studied ancient climate layers, sediments and pollen to trace what might have really happened. Around the same time as Agade's decline, evidence shows a severe drought struck the region, a century-long drying that may have crippled agriculture and trade. Without rain, the rivers shrank, salt poisoned the soil, and the empire's food supply faltered. Cities that depended on those rivers could no longer sustain their people. Armies, once well fed, began to starve. Provinces rebelled. Scribes who survived may have turned to myth to explain what science could not. The gods had withdrawn because something fundamental in nature had broken. To the people living through it, divine anger and ecological collapse were one and the same. This blending of myth and memory is what makes Agade's story haunting. The tablets we found describe divine decrees, but they also describe dust storms, famine, and the silence of empty granaries. For ancient Mesopotamians, the line between moral failure and environmental disaster didn't exist. The world was moral by design. If crops failed, someone must have sinned. If the rivers dried up, a king must have offended the gods. The Curse of Agade reflects that worldview in every line. Enlil, the high god, withdraws his blessing. The other deities follow. The once prosperous city becomes barren. The language of theology masks the evidence of collapse. Yet within that poetry lies data, the first human attempt to find meaning in catastrophe. Over time, the story outlived the city itself. Agade vanished so completely that later kings like Hammurabi could only reference it as legend. The tablets that survived were copied by scribes centuries later, their edges worn, their words partially lost. Even so, the emotion within them remains raw. You can sense the despair of people trying to understand why their gods had abandoned them. Some passages describe fields where no grain grows, rivers filled with silt, animals wandering without herdsmen. It's the language of apocalypse, yet written not with panic but resignation. The scribes didn't scream, they recorded. They turned disaster into order by pressing it into clay. In doing so, they preserved something far more enduring than the city's walls, the human need to explain loss. The Curse of Agade isn't unique in that sense. Every civilization seems to produce one. Egypt had its lamentations of chaos, the Hebrews had their exiles and psalms of destruction, but the Sumerians were among the first to write theirs down. They understood that words could outlast walls, and so, as their cities crumbled, they composed. They framed drought as divine withdrawal, failure as moral instruction. They made suffering make sense. For them, myth wasn't fantasy. It was therapy. It gave shape to grief. That's what makes reading those tablets today strangely moving. Even after 4,000 years, their anxiety feels familiar. When things fall apart, humans reach for story. It's our oldest way of surviving confusion. As we move deeper into Agade's tale, the distinctions between myth and fact blur further. Archaeologists still haven't found the city itself. Its ruins may lie beneath modern Iraq, hidden under layers of river mud. For all our satellite mapping and ground scans, Agade remains lost, and that absence feels fitting. A city destroyed by divine silence now sits in literal silence, unreachable. The curse lives on not in stone, but in the gaps of history. Yet its echo remains strong enough that scholars, poets, and scientists still trace its outline across time. The fall of Agade isn't just a story about ancient gods, it's a study in human limits. What happens when our belief in progress outpaces our understanding of balance? What happens when we think the world exists only to serve our ambitions? As you listen, think about that quiet tension between creation and collapse, between order and hubris. Every empire believes it will last forever. Every civilization builds monuments to prove it. But somewhere beneath those foundations lies a truth the Sumerians already understood. No blessing lasts forever. That doesn't make the story tragic. It makes it human. Because even when the gods turned away, the scribes kept writing. And in those words they found a kind of endurance no army could achieve. The night deepens and Agade's markets fade to silence. The silver dust settles on forgotten streets. Somewhere, far away in time, the last torch burns low inside a temple whose god no longer speaks. Yet the story remains, waiting for someone thousands of years later to whisper it again. So let's keep going, quietly. The city is gone, but its echoes are just beginning to stir. The story of Agade moves softly now into a different kind of light, one that flickers rather than burns. Once the city hummed with the sounds of its people, the grinding of grain, the clatter of trade, the low chanting from temple courtyards that rolled like waves through the narrow streets. But there comes a moment, always invisible when it begins, when abundance turns into warning. The songs that once praised the gods become quieter. The priests speak less often. The air feels heavier. In the story of the curse, this is where the silence starts. Not as sudden punishment, but as a slow forgetting, a soft unthreading of harmony between heaven and earth. In the earliest tablets that mention Agade, there's a sense of pride almost too large to contain. It was said that the city shone brighter than any other, that its temples reached higher, that its ruler was favoured above all kings. The scribes wrote of storerooms filled with silver and granaries bursting with barley, of statues so luminous they seemed to glow from within. Yet behind the glory, something restless lingered. The same texts that celebrated the empire also warned of omens. Storms that arrived out of season, fields that yielded less than expected, priests who spoke of dreams they could not interpret. To the people of Sumer, these weren't small concerns. The gods did not whisper idly. Every cloud, every shift in wind could carry meaning. The religion of Mesopotamia wasn't about belief so much as relationship. The gods were not distant beings. They were neighbours, partners in a constant exchange. Humans built temples, offered food, performed rituals, and in return the gods sustained the world. The system worked as long as both sides upheld their duties. But as Agade's empire expanded, this balance began to strain. The city's rulers, busy with conquest and wealth, expected the gods to serve their ambitions. They built monuments that honoured themselves as much as the divine. They commanded scribes to record victories as if they were eternal. And slowly, reverence gave way to pride. One tablet fragment tells of offerings that went missing from the temple of Enlil, the highest god of Sumer. It's a small detail, half broken but meaningful. In the ancient world, neglecting ritual was not a clerical error. It was a cosmic fracture. The gods did not need human food, but they required acknowledgement. A missed offering meant the rhythm of the universe faltered, even if only for a moment. It was like skipping a heartbeat. Multiply that over years of growing arrogance, and the silence begins to make sense. The gods did not rage. They simply withdrew. The myth describes this withdrawal in gentle but devastating imagery. The temples were empty of laughter, one line says. The doors of prayer were shut. Imagine a city that has forgotten how to speak its own sacred language. The priests continue their duties, but the words no longer echo. Incense burns, yet no wind carries it away. In the minds of those who lived there, this could only mean one thing. The connection between heaven and earth had been broken. In practical terms, historians see this as the slow decay of a political system stretched too far. The Akkadian Empire relied on trade routes that spanned hundreds of miles, linking city-states, farms, and mountain mines. When drought struck, or when a border rebellion disrupted the flow of goods, the whole structure trembled. The bureaucracy that once fed and taxed the land began to fail. Scribes complained of missing rations. Soldiers deserted their posts. The silence in the temples might have echoed the silence in the storehouses. Yet for those living through it, this wasn't economics. It was divine disfavor. The gods had stopped listening. There's a particular stillness that comes when a civilization realizes it has lost its center. In the story of Agade, that stillness is more frightening than war. It's the moment when certainty dissolves, when people no longer know which prayers work or which festivals matter. The priests of Enlil, once sure of their place in the cosmic order, found themselves pleading for signs that never came. The river that once swelled predictably each season began to recede too soon. The air grew hot and dry. Livestock weakened. To the farmers along the floodplain it must have seemed as if the gods were drawing their breath inward and refusing to exhale. This silence reached even into the palace. Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, was said to have consulted his dream interpreters, desperate for guidance. The tablets suggest he received none. In older times, kings were seen as intermediaries between gods and men, but Naram-Sin found the heavens mute. That kind of silence is unbearable for a ruler who believes his every act depends on divine favour, so he decided to act without permission. It's said that he attacked the temple of Enlil at Nippur, tearing down walls that were meant never to be touched by mortal hands. Whether this happened exactly as the myth claims doesn't matter. What matters is the meaning it carried. When the gods grew silent, the king mistook it for defiance and responded with violence. He struck at heaven itself. In that sense, the curse is not about magic, but about misunderstanding. The more Agade tried to assert control, the more chaotic the world became. Priests spoke of dreams filled with dust storms and empty fields. Fishermen reported the rivers turning to mud. Merchants returned from journeys with half their goods lost. Even if these events unfolded slowly over decades, to those living through them, they must have felt like the collapse of everything solid. Silence can drive people to desperate faith. If we look deeper, this part of the story reflects a truth that repeats through history. Civilizations rise through cooperation with each other, with the environment, with whatever they define as sacred, and they fall when that cooperation turns to command. The gods of Sumer weren't vengeful by nature, they were balance itself. When humans tipped that balance, silence was their only answer. It wasn't punishment, it was consequence. In the old hymns, there's a kind of grief hidden inside the reverence. You can almost hear it when they describe abandoned temples and unlit fires. The people didn't curse their gods, they mourned them. They believed that if the gods no longer dwelled in their statues, the world had lost its soul. The city that once glittered with festivals became a place of waiting. Markets stayed open, but the joy was gone from them. Children grew up in a time when the names of the old gods were still spoken but no longer felt alive. That's what the silence meant. Not the end of religion, but the fading of connection. Archaeologists who study this period find evidence that supports the mood preserved in those lines. Settlements shrink. Irrigation canals silt up. Grain storage pits show layers of abandonment, as if people left in haste or never returned after a harvest failed. The curse says the gods emptied the city. The evidence says the people simply walked away. Perhaps the two are the same thing, seen from different eyes. There's something deeply human in that silence. It reminds us that civilizations don't collapse overnight. They fade. They grow quieter year by year until only the echo of what they were remains. The story of the curse captures that moment perfectly. It gives voice to the stillness, explaining it not as decay, but as a divine mystery. The gods grew silent because humans forgot how to listen. And yet, in the hush that followed, the scribes kept writing. They recorded the omens, the failed floods, the unanswered prayers. They pressed into clay the memory of a world holding its breath. Those fragments, carried through centuries of dust and rediscovery, became the very reason we still know Agade's name. The gods may have turned away, but the people did not stop speaking to them. The silence was only ever half complete. The night deepens again. The fires of Agade burn lower, and the voice of its ruler grows restless. In the quiet of his palace, surrounded by priests who can no longer find words from heaven, he decides that waiting is no longer enough. What follows will turn the silence into storm, and the storm into legend. Before the silence, before the curse, Agade stood like a dream that believed itself awake. To imagine it is to picture light falling over endless brick walls, the air heavy with the scent of oil and grain, the sound of donkeys' hooves clattering through narrow streets packed with traders calling out in languages that mingled into a single hum. The city was alive in a way the tablets could only hint at. They called it the jewel of the empire, the place where the rivers met ambition and the land itself bent to human order. If Sumer was the cradle of civilization, Agade was its first restless child, bright, proud, and endlessly hungry for more. Sargon, the empire's founder, had built it from nothing. He rose from a man who served water to a king, or so the legend goes, to one who commanded armies across the plains. The tablets that survive tell his story with reverence, half history, half myth. He claimed that the goddess Ishtar granted him victory, that his right to rule came not from inheritance but from divine favour. Agade was to be his proof. It would be a city unlike any other, a centre for the world he had conquered. Ships from Dilmun brought copper and pearls. Caravans from the east carried tin, lapis lazuli and timber. Grain from the fertile plains filled its silos. The city became a warehouse of abundance, its granaries stacked so high that scribes had to invent new accounting symbols to keep track of it all. Life in Agade was measured by trade and ritual. Every sunrise began with offerings to the gods, and every evening ended with the tallying of goods. Scribes, their styluses sharp, worked by the light of oil lamps, pressing wedge-shaped marks into damp clay. Each mark meant something. Barley counted, silver weighed, copper received, labour performed. These records were not mere bureaucracy. They were the pulse of the city. In a place where time was marked by the flooding of rivers and the hum of commerce, writing became its heartbeat. Clay tablets replaced oral memory. Numbers replaced stories. Yet even then the two were never fully separate. Every ledger carried whispers of worship. Each transaction began with the symbol of a god's name, as though no trade could exist without divine permission. Walking through the city, one might have seen its contrasts more clearly than any tablet could record. The palace, enormous and carefully planned, stood near the temple district. Its walls were polished with gypsum to gleam pale under the sun. The smell of bitumen and reed mats mixed with incense drifting from nearby shrines. Musicians played lyres during ceremonies, the same melodies heard in cities hundreds of miles away, unified by empire. Agade was not only wealthy, it was connected. Roads radiated outward from its gates like threads from a loom, binding distant lands to its centre. Messengers could travel weeks through desert and still call themselves citizens of Agade when they arrived. That was the power of Sargon's creation, a shared identity written across miles of dust and stone. To live in Agade was to believe in permanence. The city's architects built with confidence, stacking mud bricks upon foundations thick enough to outlast storms. The ziggurat rose above the skyline, a mountain of faith in the flat expanse of Mesopotamia. From its top, priests read omens in the movement of stars. They believed heaven and earth were connected by invisible cords, and that Agade's tower was their knot. At night, torches glowed along its steps, flickering like a crown of fire. Travellers arriving after sunset must have thought they were approaching a star that had descended to the plain. The ordinary people of the city lived in houses packed close together, their roofs flat, their courtyards shaded by awnings of woven palm. In the evenings, the rooftops came alive with families eating, talking, or watching the sky fade from copper to black. Clay ovens baked bread that smelled faintly sweet from barley. Water sellers passed with jars balanced on shoulders. Children played with clay toys shaped like animals, their laughter mixing with the calls of distant herders returning from the fields. The world must have seemed safe, predictable, blessed. Silver dust became a symbol of Agade's wealth. It wasn't literal dust, though the city's air was full of fine grit that shimmered in the sunlight. It referred to the way the merchants weighed their silver powder to buy and sell goods. The phrase appeared in songs, Agade, city of silver dust, where every weight is full and every jar overflows. There's something almost innocent in that boast. It shows how deeply people trusted the system they lived in. They believed the gods had rewarded them for their greatness, that prosperity was proof of virtue. And why wouldn't they? The markets thrived, the temples overflowed with offerings, and the empire's reach seemed endless. But prosperity, like any rhythm, can only hold so long before it begins to strain. The very success of Agade became its vulnerability. As the empire grew, its cities demanded more grain, more labour, more tribute. Sargon's conquests stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Elam, and each region expected its share of the bounty. Roads that once carried trade began to carry taxes and soldiers. Farmers were conscripted to dig canals or serve in distant wars. Merchants who once traded freely now needed imperial permits. A system that had once united the land began to weigh it down. Even within the walls of Agade, the signs of tension appeared in subtle ways. The scribes began recording rations for temple workers that grew smaller year by year. Clay tablets show lists of slaves bought to replace local labourers who had fled to avoid taxation. The city was still glittering, but the shine was thinning. In the stories that later formed the Curse of Agade, this period of uneasy abundance became the calm before divine withdrawal. The people, it said, forgot humility. They built towers higher, hoarded silver more greedily, and began to treat the gods as servants rather than masters. The priests who had once advised rulers found themselves overshadowed by generals and administrators. Religion was no longer guidance, it was spectacle. Grand processions displayed wealth rather than devotion. Temples collected tribute like treasuries. Even the goddess Ishtar, once seen as Sargon's protector, was portrayed in carvings more as a symbol of conquest than of love or fertility. It was as if the entire city had turned its faith inward, worshipping its own reflection. Still, to the people living there, it must have seemed natural. When every harvest fills the granaries, when ships arrive daily from distant shores, why imagine an end? The world had never looked more secure, yet that illusion of permanence was fragile. The rivers that sustained the fields were beginning to change. Silt built up in canals faster than they could be cleared. Rain fell unevenly, and when it came, it often brought floods that destroyed what it was meant to nourish. The same systems that had fed the city now threatened to choke it. Sargon's dynasty, though powerful, could not escape the weight of its own success. By the time Naram-Sin came to power, Agade was both capital and burden. The expectations placed upon its ruler were immense. Every festival, every offering, every campaign had to maintain the illusion that divine favour was constant. But empires are not sustained by illusion for long. Beneath the surface, anxiety spread. Whispered doubts, strange omens. Priests who warned that Enlil's temple at Nippur no longer answered prayers. To us those omens read like stories. To them they were signals of imbalance, the first cracks in the foundation of order. The city still glittered, but its people had begun to sense that something unseen was shifting. When wealth is everywhere, fear often hides behind it. The richer Agade became, the more it feared losing what it had. There's a quiet poignancy in the thought of those final years before decline. The same streets that once celebrated victory would soon see shortages. The same temples that rang with hymns would echo with unanswered prayers. But no one could have known that yet. For now, Agade remained the city of endless grain and silver dust, unaware that its glory had already peaked, that its story was already being written in the language of loss. The river still flowed, the scribes still marked the clay. And above the city, as the sun burned its reflection off the palace walls, Naram-Sin stood on his terrace, surveying a kingdom that looked eternal. Somewhere in the distance, though, the horizon began to pale with the heat of a long, dry wind, the kind that carries change too slow to notice until it's already here. Before the silence, before the curse, Agade stood like a dream that believed itself awake. To imagine it is to picture light falling over endless brick walls, the air heavy with the scent of oil and grain, the sound of donkeys' hooves clattering through narrow streets packed with traders calling out in languages that mingled into a single hum. The city was alive in a way the tablets could only hint at. They called it the jewel of the empire, the place where the rivers met ambition and the land itself bent to human order. If Sumer was the cradle of civilization, Agade was its first restless child, bright, proud, and endlessly hungry for more. Sargon, the empire's founder, had built it from nothing. He rose from a man who served water to a king, or so the legend goes, to one who commanded armies across the plains. The tablets that survive tell his story with reverence, half history, half myth. He claimed that the goddess Ishtar granted him victory, that his right to rule came not from inheritance but from divine favour. Agade was to be his proof. It would be a city unlike any other, a centre for the world he had conquered. Ships from Dilmun brought copper and pearls. Caravans from the east carried tin, lapis lazuli and timber. Grain from the fertile plains filled its silos. The city became a warehouse of abundance, its granaries stacked so high that scribes had to invent new accounting symbols to keep track of it all. Life in Agade was measured by trade and ritual. Every sunrise began with offerings to the gods, and every evening ended with the tallying of goods. Scribes, their styluses sharp, worked by the light of oil lamps, pressing wedge-shaped marks into damp clay. Each mark meant something. Barley counted, silver weighed, copper received, labour performed. These records were not mere bureaucracy. They were the pulse of the city. In a place where time was marked by the flooding of rivers and the hum of commerce, writing became its heartbeat. Clay tablets replaced oral memory. Numbers replaced stories. Yet even then, the two were never fully separate. Every ledger carried whispers of worship. Each transaction began with the symbol of a god's name, as though no trade could exist without divine permission. Walking through the city, one might have seen its contrasts more clearly than any tablet could record. The palace, enormous and carefully planned, stood near the temple district. Its walls were polished with gypsum to gleam pale under the sun. The smell of bitumen and reed mats mixed with incense drifting from nearby shrines. Musicians played lyres during ceremonies, the same melodies heard in cities hundreds of miles away, unified by empire. Agade was not only wealthy, it was connected. Roads radiated outward from its gates like threads from a loom, binding distant lands to its centre. Messengers could travel weeks through desert and still call themselves citizens of Agade when they arrived. That was the power of Sargon's creation, a shared identity written across miles of dust and stone. To live in Agade was to believe in permanence. The city's architects built with confidence, stacking mud bricks upon foundations thick enough to outlast storms. The ziggurat rose above the skyline, a mountain of faith in the flat expanse of Mesopotamia. From its top, priests read omens in the movement of stars. They believed heaven and earth were connected by invisible cords, and that Agade's tower was their knot. At night, torches glowed along its steps, flickering like a crown of fire. Travellers arriving after sunset must have thought they were approaching a star that had descended to the plain. The ordinary people of the city lived in houses packed close together, their roofs flat, their courtyards shaded by awnings of woven palm. In the evenings, the rooftops came alive with families eating, talking, or watching. The sky faded from copper to black. Clay ovens baked bread that smelled faintly sweet from barley. Water sellers passed with jars balanced on shoulders. Children played with clay toys shaped like animals, their laughter mixing with the calls of distant herders returning from the fields. The world must have seemed safe, predictable, blessed. Silver dust became a symbol of Agade's wealth. It wasn't literal dust, though the city's air was full of fine grit that shimmered in the sunlight. It referred to the way the merchants weighed their silver powder to buy and sell goods. The phrase appeared in songs, Agade, city of silver dust, where every weight is full and every jar overflows. There's something almost innocent in that boast. It shows how deeply people trusted the system they lived in. They believed the gods had rewarded them for their greatness, that prosperity was proof of virtue. And why wouldn't they? The markets thrived. The temples overflowed with offerings, and the empire's reach seemed endless. But prosperity, like any rhythm, can only hold so long before it begins to strain. The very success of Agade became its vulnerability. As the empire grew, its cities demanded more grain, more labour, more tribute. Sargon's conquest stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Elam, and each region expected its share of the bounty. Roads that once carried trade began to carry taxes and soldiers. Farmers were conscripted to dig canals or serve in distant wars. Merchants who once traded freely now needed imperial permits. A system that had once united the land began to weigh it down. Even within the walls of Agade, the signs of tension appeared in subtle ways. The scribes began recording rations for temple workers that grew smaller year by year. Clay tablets show lists of slaves bought to replace local labourers who had fled to avoid taxation. The city was still glittering, but the shine was thinning. In the stories that later formed the Curse of Agade, this period of uneasy abundance became the calm before divine withdrawal. The people, it said, forgot humility. They built towers higher, hoarded silver more greedily, and began to treat the gods as servants rather than masters. The priests who had once advised rulers found themselves overshadowed by generals and administrators. Religion was no longer guidance, it was spectacle. Grand processions displayed wealth rather than devotion. Temples collected tribute like treasuries. Even the goddess Ishtar, once seen as Sargon's protector, was portrayed in carvings more as a symbol of conquest than of love or fertility. It was as if the entire city had turned its faith inward, worshipping its own reflection. Still, to the people living there, it must have seemed natural. When every harvest fills the granaries, when ships arrive daily from distant shores, why imagine an end? The world had never looked more secure. Yet that illusion of permanence was fragile. The rivers that sustained the fields were beginning to change. Silt built up in canals faster than they could be cleared. Rain fell unevenly, and when it came, it often brought floods that destroyed what it was meant to nourish. The same systems that had fed the city now threatened to choke it. Sargon's dynasty, though powerful, could not escape the weight of its own success. By the time Naram-Sin came to power, Agade was both capital and burden. The expectations placed upon its ruler were immense. Every festival, every offering, every campaign had to maintain the illusion that divine favour was constant. But empires are not sustained by illusion for long. Beneath the surface, anxiety spread, whispered doubts, strange omens, priests who warned that Enlil's temple at Nippur no longer answered prayers. To us, those omens read like stories. To them, they were signals of imbalance, the first cracks in the foundation of order. The city still glittered, but its people had begun to sense that something unseen was shifting. When wealth is everywhere, fear often hides behind it. The richer Agade became, the more it feared losing what it had. There's a quiet poignancy in the thought of those final years before decline. The same streets that once celebrated victory would soon see shortages. The same temples that rang with hymns would echo with unanswered prayers. But no one could have known that yet, for now Agade remained the city of endless grain and silver dust, unaware that its glory had already peaked, that its story was already being written in the language of loss. The river still flowed, the scribes still marked the clay, and above the city, as the sun burned its reflection off the palace walls, Naram-Sin stood on his terrace, surveying a kingdom that looked eternal. Somewhere in the distance, though, the horizon began to pale with the heat of a long, dry wind, the kind that carries change too slow to notice until it's already here. The empire had stretched itself thin, its roads worn by soldiers and caravans, its cities tied together by the promise that the king's power was eternal. But promises, like the rivers of Sumer, could shift course without warning. Naram-Sin, who had once been the favoured son of the gods, began to hear murmurs of revolt on the horizon. The lands that had once sent tribute now sent defiance. In the foothills to the north, small kingdoms whispered rebellion. Traders returning from the mountains spoke of fortified towns refusing to pay their dues. Grain ships that should have arrived by river went missing, seized or destroyed. To an empire built on obedience, disobedience was contagion. The clay records that survive from those years speak with a tone that feels both weary and frantic. The scribes counted soldiers, listed rations, measured weapons, recorded the repair of walls. The empire was preparing for war, not of conquest this time, but of preservation. To the citizens of Agade, the unrest beyond their borders seemed distant at first, just noise from the edges of the map. But within the palace, Naram-Sin saw it differently. To him, rebellion was not merely political, it was cosmic. His authority came from heaven, so those who defied him were, in his eyes, defying the divine itself. He ordered the armies of Agade to march north toward the land of the Lullaby, a rugged people of the Zagros Mountains who had resisted imperial control for decades. The mountains were unlike the fertile plains, harsh, unpredictable, full of ravines where ambushes could spring like ghosts. The soldiers who marched there carried not only weapons but the weight of their ruler's conviction. They were not told they were fighting for territory or tribute. They were told they were fighting for the favour of the gods, to restore a cosmic order that had begun to unravel. The myth that grew from this campaign would later claim that Naram-Sin waged war not against men but against heaven itself. It says he attacked the mountain sacred to Enlil, the father of the gods, because no oracle would answer him. In that act, the tale says, he awakened divine anger so fierce that the gods withdrew their blessing from all of Sumer. Whether or not that event happened as described, the kernel of truth beneath it is visible in the archaeological record. A vast military expedition did take place. It was costly, brutal, and likely disastrous. The evidence points to widespread destruction in the mountain regions and an empire straining to maintain its reach. Imagine the scene from the soldier's perspective. Weeks of marching under the blazing sun, carrying supplies across rough terrain, the rivers behind them shrinking as the season dried. They would have seen villages abandoned before they arrived, fields untended, wells dry. The locals, desperate or defiant, would have retreated into the hills. Each valley looked the same, silent and waiting. The campaign dragged on, and the silence that had haunted the temples of Agade seemed to follow them into the mountains. When the battles finally came, they were fierce and chaotic. The mountain tribes fought with ambush and retreat, striking from the rocks and vanishing before the Akkadian formations could respond. The soldiers of Agade, trained for open plains, found themselves climbing steep passes where armour was a burden and the air thin. They built camps that lasted only days, each one marked by exhaustion and dwindling supplies. The inscriptions that commemorate the war tell of victory, of course. They always do. But the layers of ruin uncovered by archaeologists suggest something more complicated. Entire garrisons were lost. Villages burned, not as spoils of conquest, but as acts of desperation. It was during this campaign that Naram-Sin's transformation from king to god was most complete. the soldiers began to call him the mighty, the divine, words they might have spoken half in awe, half in fear. To question his decisions was to question fate itself. When messages from the front reached Agade, they were carved with exaggerated triumphs, enemy kings defeated, mountains subdued, but the tone betrays anxiety. The victories grew more elaborate as the reality grew worse. When no answers came from the gods, Naram-Sin supplied his own. He ordered the creation of monuments celebrating divine conquest, statues showing him taller than any human, his horned crown catching the light. The priests back in Agade must have watched this with unease. To them, the war against the mountain people was already perilous. To turn it into a holy war against a sacred mountain was unthinkable. Enlil's temple in Nippur, the spiritual centre of Sumer, stood as a reminder that no mortal could command the divine. But in the king's mind, victory would prove his right to rule even the gods themselves. The stele carved after the campaign shows him ascending a mountain beneath the stars, trampling enemies who plead for mercy. It's a portrait of triumph, yet the sky above him is crowded with symbols that look less like blessings and more like witnesses. As the story goes, that victory was hollow. The campaign drained the empire's strength. The soldiers returned to Agade weary, their numbers reduced, their morale broken. The spoils of war could not make up for the cost. The fields they left behind had gone untended. The irrigation canals silted over. Famine began to flicker in the provinces, and worse than famine was doubt. The creeping sense that the gods had grown impatient with human ambition. When the priests looked for signs in the entrails of sacrificed animals, the omens turned dark. The livers they read were marked by blemishes that signified divine anger. In the Curse of Agade, this is the turning point. The text describes how, after Naram-Sin's war against the holy mountain, Enlil's wrath spread through the land. He struck the people with silence, the tablet says. The sky withheld its rain. The earth refused its grain. The description feels both mythic and plausible, a poetic record of a real drought that swept across the Near East near the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. The climate data tells the same story. Less rainfall, rising salinity, a collapse of agriculture. The gods did not need to speak, nature spoke for them. For the citizens of Agade, this must have felt like the world reversing itself. The city that once measured time by harvests now measured it by hunger. Markets that had overflowed with goods became quiet. Caravans stopped arriving. The canals turned to mud, and the temple fires burned lower each night. The priests who had once blessed the king's campaigns began to whisper prayers for forgiveness instead. But forgiveness, like rain, did not come. The myth interprets all of this through divine causality. The gods, offended by Naram-Sin's arrogance, withdrew their protection and sent hostile nations against him. The Gutians, a people from the mountains to the east, invaded Mesopotamia soon after, overrunning cities weakened by famine. Whether by coincidence or consequence, the empire broke apart within a generation. The curse and the conquest became one story. The wrath of heaven manifesting through human hands. In reality, no single event destroyed Agade. It was the accumulation of many small fractures, economic strain, environmental stress, political rebellion, all of which found their voice in the myth of a king who angered the gods. Yet the power of that myth lies in its simplicity. It turned chaos into narrative, randomness into morality. People could understand divine anger. They could not understand climate collapse. Even as Agade began to crumble, the city tried to hold on to its rituals. The priests continued to burn incense before statues that no longer seemed to hear. The last surviving tablets from the period list offerings reduced to fractions of what they once were. The gods had not just turned away, they had become unaffordable. The city that once overflowed with silver dust now counted every grain. And through it all the memory of the war lingered. It had begun as an act of defiance and ended as a legend of ruin. The soldiers who had marched to the mountains returned as shadows of themselves, carrying stories of lands so barren they seemed cursed. When they spoke of the battlefields, they described not the enemy's strength, but the weight of the sky, the way the air itself seemed to resist them. It was as if the world had decided to push back. For later generations, Naram-Sin's war became the hinge of history, the moment when human ambition crossed a line invisible but absolute. In every version of the tale, whether inscribed in cuneiform or retold centuries later, the message remains the same. The higher the climb, the farther the fall. But even in that fall, there's a strange kind of continuity. The myth survived because people needed it to. It offered structure to the chaos they had lived through, a reason the gods might have turned their faces away. The storms that followed would finish what pride had begun. Drought deepened into collapse. Trade routes withered. Cities that once sang the hymns of Agade began to chant their own laments. Somewhere in the ruins, the tablets say, a single flame still burned in the temple of Ishtar, the goddess who had once favoured Sargon's line. But her priests no longer spoke of victory. They prayed only that the wind would change. The king who dreamed of heaven had awakened the gods' anger, and now the world itself began to echo their silence. From the mountains he had tried to conquer. The winds carried dust back toward the plains, spreading over canals, fields, and the empty streets of Agade. The empire's glory dulled under that fine, relentless powder. What began as conquest had become erasure, and soon even the memory of the city would start to fade beneath the dust that never stopped falling. The fall of an empire rarely begins with thunder. It begins with a change in the air, so small, so patient, that no one notices until it's already everywhere. For Agade, that change began with the rivers. The twin arteries of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, had always been the city's quiet gods, their waters the pulse that fed every field and every life. When they flowed as they should, the world felt ordered. When they faltered, the world lost its rhythm. Somewhere in the last years of Naram-Sin's reign, the rhythm broke. The earliest signs were subtle. The floods that should have come in spring arrived late or not at all. Farmers waited with tools in their hands, watching the riverbanks crack. The irrigation canals, once clear and deep, began to clog with silt. The water still shimmered under the sun, but it moved differently, slower, reluctant. Tablets from the later Akkadian period record smaller grain rations, complaints from overseers, and desperate pleas for labourers to dredge the canals. Even in those dry administrative lines, the anxiety is visible. The empire was not built to endure stillness. In a world without rain, every drop of river water mattered. The canals were the veins of civilization. Without them, the fields turned pale and brittle. Barley wilted in the soil before it could seed. Herds dwindled as the pastures turned to dust. The people of Agade had no word for climate change, no concept of global drought cycles, but they had the language of myth. And in that language, this slow dying of the land could only mean one thing. The gods had withdrawn their blessing. The same divine withdrawal that priests once feared had now become visible in the earth itself. Archaeologists today can read those years in the ground. Sediment cores taken from the ancient floodplains show a band of fine dust where fertile soil should have been. Beneath the microscope, that dust tells the story of a changing sky. Fewer rains, hotter seasons, winds strong enough to strip the surface clean. Across the region, from northern Syria to the Persian Gulf, the evidence repeats. Crops failed, cities shrank, trade halted. The great unity that had once bound Sumer to Agade began to splinter into hunger and disbelief. In the temples, priests continued to recite hymns of plenty. Their chants rose into air that smelled of dry clay and despair. Rituals multiplied in number and intensity. Animals were sacrificed, incense burned, rivers blessed in vain. The priest looked to the skies for signs, but the heavens offered none. The moon still moved through its phases, the stars still burned above, but the connection between those patterns and human fortune had gone silent. To a civilization that understood life as a negotiation with the divine, silence was the cruelest punishment. Outside the city, the farmers endured it first. They were the empire's foundation, and they felt it crumble beneath their feet. Without water, their fields cracked. Salt crept up from the earth, whitening the soil. The once regular rhythm of planting and harvest broke. Villages emptied as families packed what they could carry, and followed the receding rivers north, searching for land that would still grow grain. Some joined caravans heading toward the foothills. Others became raiders, attacking travellers for food and water. The records describe them as bandits, but they were survivors. The empire called it rebellion. In truth, it was famine. In Agade itself, the change unfolded slowly enough to be denied. The city's reservoirs still held water, and its granaries, though shrinking, remained stocked. For a time, the illusion of abundance persisted. The merchants still traded, though the markets grew quieter. Silver no longer flowed as easily, and the air carried more dust each year. The scribes continued their tallies, counting rations in smaller units, then smaller still. Each tablet pressed into clay was another record of adaptation, another attempt to maintain the appearance of control. There's something profoundly human in that persistence. Civilizations rarely recognize collapse while living through it. They adjust. They explain. They hold festivals. Even as the streets grow emptier, they tell themselves it's temporary, that the gods are merely testing them. In the Curse of Agade, the drought becomes divine vengeance, a narrative simple enough to grasp, yet vast enough to contain every loss. The poem says Enlil, enraged by Naram-Sin's arrogance, commanded the rivers to stop their flow. The canals dried, the fields died, the people starved. To later generations, it was the perfect story, a moral lesson shaped like a flood reversed. But beneath the moral lies the memory of environmental disaster, carried for centuries in myth. For the people living through it, the days must have blurred into sameness. The same yellow sky, the same thin light reflecting off dust. The wind carried the taste of salt from the parched soil. The once green reed beds turned brown. The songs of the fishermen stopped, replaced by the creak of empty boats left on dry channels. Even the animals changed their patterns. Birds that once nested near the water disappeared. Herds wandered farther each season in search of grazing. The landscape itself seemed to withdraw, as though mimicking the gods who had turned away. The priests tried to interpret this withdrawal. They spoke of Enki, god of wisdom and water, retreating to the deep beneath the earth. They said Ishtar's tears had turned bitter, that the storm god Adad had grown weary of human noise. Every myth was an explanation for silence. But when no ritual brought relief, the stories began to darken. Whispers spread that Naram-Sin's sin was unforgivable, that the curse could not be lifted. Some said the city's temples were haunted by echoes of divine anger. Others claimed the gods had abandoned Sumer altogether, moving their favour to lands beyond the mountains. In this atmosphere of fear, the political unity of the empire collapsed completely. Governors in distant cities stopped sending tribute. Armies deserted. Trade routes broke apart as roads filled with refugees. The empire that had once connected half the known world had become a collection of hungry cities watching the sky. And still the king's palace stood, its white walls gleaming faintly through the dust storms, like a monument to disbelief. If you walked through Agade during those years, you might still have found traces of its former splendour. The ziggurat still rose above the horizon, though its steps were coated in wind-blown sand. The market still operated, though the stalls were fewer and their goods meaner. You might have passed scribes sitting in shaded courtyards, their tablets filled not with records of abundance but with lists of shortages. Clay has no emotion, yet the tablets feel tired, their strokes less certain. It's as if even the act of writing had become a ritual of endurance. The physical withdrawal of the rivers became the emotional withdrawal of the gods. The people began to doubt not just their king, but the very structure of the world. The relationship between humans and the divine, once seen as constant exchange, now felt one-sided. Offerings vanished into silence. Prayers fell like dust. The water that once carried life now carried only reflection, the glimmer of a city learning how fragile prosperity can be. Modern climatologists studying those layers of soil can trace the drought that struck Mesopotamia around 2200 BCE. They find evidence of a regional collapse that spanned hundreds of miles. Settlements were abandoned, populations migrated, trade shifted northward to cooler lands. Yet the ancient storytellers didn't need data to understand its magnitude. They turned observation into meaning. In their view, the rivers had personalities, tempers, and loyalties. When they left, it was not a mechanical process, but a betrayal. The world they knew depended on a delicate balance between human reverence and natural order, and both had failed at once. There's a moment in the poem of the Curse when the scribe describes the aftermath. The waters did not rise, the seeds did not sprout, the people ceased to sing. It's a line that captures both history and grief. Those words could have been written in any age. They are the sound of civilization realizing that nature, once mastered, will not always obey. And yet, through that despair, something endures. The same people who watched the rivers vanish were the ones who wrote the story down. They preserved their failure as carefully as they once preserved their triumphs. That is why we still know them. The drying of the rivers was not the end of memory. It was the beginning of history as reflection. They recorded not just what happened, but what it meant. The drought would eventually break. The rivers would return, reshaped, slower, less generous. But by then, the empire was gone. The city that had been called the heart of the world was already emptying. The silence that began in the temples had spread to the streets. The people had gone in search of water, and the gods, it seemed, had followed. When the rivers withdrew, they didn't only take the crops or the trade or the cities. They took the illusion of permanence, the belief that human will could command the elements. What remained was dust, memory, and a story. A story that would whisper through the centuries, retold in fragments of clay, reminding those who came after that even the mightiest empires are only as strong as the rivers that choose to stay. The wind kept blowing, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and the dry sigh of the plains. Far away, in the fading light, the outlines of abandoned canals shimmered like veins beneath a skin long drained of blood. Somewhere, the last farmer of Agade stood beside a trickle of water and watched it vanish into the sand. He didn't curse the gods or the king. He simply turned and walked north, following the same path the rivers once took, leaving behind the city that had lost its sound. When the city began to empty, when the temples no longer burned incense and the palace halls echoed only with the wind, the scribes stayed. They were the last to leave Agade, not out of devotion to the king or the gods, but to the tablets. For them, the clay was sacred in its own quiet way. Every symbol pressed into it was a small defiance against oblivion. When the soldiers had gone and the markets had fallen silent, the scribes still sat at their low tables, marking words into wet earth that would one day harden and survive the very world that abandoned them. It was through their hands that the memory of the curse took shape. They had no armies, no temples, no means to reverse the famine or the silence, but they had the power to describe. To write was to hold back chaos, to make the incomprehensible at least recordable. The men who carved those signs into clay may never have known they were writing the first elegy in human history, the story of a civilization trying to understand its own undoing. We often imagine history as the work of kings, but in moments like this it belongs to those who wrote about them. The scribes watched Agade crumble grain by grain. They saw the empty granaries, the cracked canals, the priests reciting prayers that no one answered. They recorded the list of deaths, the rations reduced to nothing, the royal decrees that grew shorter and more desperate with each passing season. Yet their writing never turned hysterical. It stayed measured, calm, even gentle. The tone of the tablets is always the same, steady as if precision itself could restore order. The Akkadian word for scribe was dubsar, literally tablet writer. It carried dignity and burden. Scribes were trained from childhood, memorizing signs until their hands could move without hesitation. They learned to copy text perfectly, each mark identical to the one before. That discipline was not just about accuracy. It was a way of keeping the world stable through repetition. If everything around them was falling apart, the act of writing became a small imitation of creation. Each sign pressed into clay was a gesture of control, a way to say, something still endures. When the priests lost faith and the rulers lost power, the scribes began to write differently. They no longer counted harvests or measured taxes. They began to tell stories. Out of the fragments of history, they shaped meaning. And from that meaning came the Curse of Agade. It is not a royal inscription or a hymn. It is a lament, a hybrid of memory and theology. Its voice is collective, as if spoken by the civilization itself. In it the gods withdraw, the land fails, and the once great King Naram-Sin becomes a tragic figure punished for hubris. But the text does not only condemn him, it mourns him. That duality is what makes it so human. The scribes understood that a world can end through arrogance, but it can also end through misunderstanding. Each line of the poem is layered with centuries of thought. Enlil turned his face away, it says, and the winds devoured the fields. The words could be literal or symbolic. They don't distinguish between divine action and natural disaster, because for those who wrote them, there was no distinction. The scribes were not scientists, they were witnesses, and witnesses do not explain, they preserve. Their writing doesn't tell us how the rivers dried or how the empire fell. It tells us how it felt. In those lines you can hear the stillness of empty streets, the dust settling on idols, the quiet disbelief of the people who thought their gods had left forever. You can also hear something else, resilience. Even as the world they described ended, they found a way to make it last. The irony is that we know of Agade only because it was cursed. Without that poem, without those scribes, its name might have vanished completely. The story that mourned the city also saved it. Centuries later, long after Agade's ruins were swallowed by the earth, later generations of scribes in Babylon and Assur would copy the Curse of Agade again and again. They didn't live through its drought or its famine, yet they felt its weight. They treated it as a text of warning and wisdom. Students in temple schools memorized its lines as lessons in humility and devotion. To them, the fall of Agade was not just an event. It was a pattern, a cycle that could repeat. The gods give, humans overreach, the gods withdraw, and memory begins again. Each recopying was an act of remembrance, ensuring that the first empire's failure would never be entirely forgotten. In that way, the scribes became the real architects of immortality. The kings built walls that crumbled, the priests raised temples that turned to dust, but the scribes built something that could outlast the weather, language. Their clay tablets, buried and baked by accident or fire, became time capsules. They crossed millennia unseen, waiting in the ground until archaeologists unearthed them under the same sun that once baked their surface. When they were first translated in the 19th century, their words still held the rhythm of hands that pressed them 4,000 years before. There's a quiet poetry in imagining one of those final scribes. The city outside his workshop is half deserted. The wind moans through empty streets. He sits in the shade, clay bowl beside him, water almost gone. He shapes a tablet, smooths its surface, and begins to write. Agade, city of silver dust, city abandoned by its gods. His stylus moves slowly. Each wedge mark is deliberate, not hurried, as though care itself could undo decay. He doesn't write to be read. He writes because to stop would mean admitting it's over. That's the strange mercy of writing. It creates continuity where none should exist. The same act that recorded Agade's rise now recorded its ruin. The same alphabet that once sang the glory of kings now whispered their fall. Through that symmetry, the scribes gave tragedy form, and in giving it form, they gave it dignity. Modern readers often approach the Curse of Agade as myth, but in its rhythm there is the clear structure of observation. The repetition of lines mimics ritual. The descriptions of drought, famine and despair feel too specific to be invention. The young did not grow old, one line says. The old did not grow wise. It's not just theology, it's social memory turned to verse. The scribes captured what it meant for time itself to feel broken. Every civilization leaves behind two kinds of ruins, the visible ones made of stone, and the invisible ones made of words. The first crumble under the weather. The second travel forward, fragile but persistent. The scribes of Agade couldn't stop their city from dying, but they refused to let it disappear. Their tablets crossed thousands of years of silence and reintroduced themselves to us as if nothing had changed. They outlasted every empire that came after. To write at the edge of collapse is to resist erasure. The scribes didn't know who would read their words or when. They only knew that someone should. They were the bridge between the living and the forgotten. And perhaps that is the real meaning of the curse. Not punishment, but preservation. The gods turned away, the rivers withdrew, the people scattered, but the story remained. Even now, when archaeologists brush the dust from those tablets, the same dust that once buried the city, the marks are still sharp. The language still holds shape. The scribes are still speaking. Through them, Agade breathes again, not as a place of power, but as a memory that refuses to die. The wind moves softly through what used to be streets, and in that wind, if you listen long enough, you might almost hear the scratch of a stylus against clay, slow and careful, marking the final lines of a world being written into eternity. There was a time when the gods of Sumer were not ideas but presences, seen in the rising smoke, felt in the rhythm of the flood, heard in the chant of morning prayers. Every temple was a dwelling place, not metaphor but home. Each statue, sculpted with inlaid eyes of shell and lapis lazuli, was believed to watch and listen. When the people offered bread, beer and incense, they weren't performing symbols. They were feeding their gods, maintaining the balance between earth and heaven. The city lived only because its temples breathed. But when the rivers withdrew and the fields went dry, when the crops failed and the wind turned hot and sour, the people began to believe that the gods themselves had moved away. It was not merely hunger that haunted the streets of Agade. It was absence. The priests still climbed the ziggurat to light the morning fires, but the flame felt weak. The smoke rose and hung heavy in the air, drifting without direction. The songs that once filled the courtyards became uncertain, the voices thin, like echoes waiting for an answer that never came. The poem of the Curse of Agade speaks of this moment in simple, devastating words. The temples were emptied of laughter, the shrines of their splendour. The gods abandoned their cities like birds their nests. For a people who believed the divine lived among them, this was the truest form of death. Walls could crumble, fields could dry, but as long as the gods stayed, there was hope. Once they left, nothing could hold the world together. The withdrawal of the gods wasn't imagined as sudden. It unfolded slowly, like the fading of the light at dusk. One by one, the deities were said to depart. Enlil, the lord of wind and order, left his sanctuary at Nippur first. Then Inanna, Ishtar, whose favour had once carried Sargon to victory, turned her gaze away. Ea, the god of wisdom and water, sank back into the deep. Even Shamash, the sun god, was said to rise dimmer in those years. The mythology describes this as a migration, a kind of celestial exile. The gods were not destroyed. They simply refused to live among humans any longer. Archaeology gives the myth texture. Excavations of late Akkadian temples show signs of neglect. Altars stripped, statues missing, shrines filled with debris. In some sites, priests seem to have buried sacred objects deliberately, as if protecting them from desecration or awaiting the gods' return. The act of burying, like the act of writing, was a kind of hope. If the gods ever came back, their possessions would be waiting. But they never did. To understand what this meant, you have to think about what a temple was in that world. It wasn't just a place of prayer, it was a machine for balance. The temple distributed grain, managed labour, oversaw trade, collected offerings, and recorded time. When the gods left, those systems broke. Economics, religion, and meaning were the same thing in Sumer. They rose and fell together. The people didn't simply lose faith, they lost structure. Every day became unpredictable. Every hour stretched longer. In the old hymns, the gods' departure is described almost tenderly. They went like weary travellers, one fragment says, carrying their radiance as a lamp in a dark land. The image is not of wrath but of sorrow, as though the divine could no longer bear to watch the suffering of its people. It's a strange inversion of blame, not that the gods punished humanity, but that they couldn't stay to witness its pain. For those left behind, that distinction didn't matter. Absence and anger felt the same. The priests tried to fill that void with ritual. They kept the fires burning, the chants flowing, the tablets inscribed. They built new idols, hoping fresh forms might entice the gods back. They held processions through empty streets, singing the hymns of plenty as though sound alone could recreate it. But faith is not sustained by repetition alone. Without reciprocity, without the tangible signs of divine presence, the rituals became hollow. They were performances for an unseen audience. The stories that survive suggest the people understood this in their own way. They began to speak of the gods as travellers, moving from city to city, searching for a place still worthy of their light. One text says that Enlil took refuge in the mountains, that Ishtar wept over her lost temples, that the other gods followed like a caravan across the sky. The image is both myth and metaphor. It describes what happens when people lose faith in institutions that once defined their world. The divine departure is the collapse of trust made visible. In a broader sense, this was a turning point for Mesopotamian thought. The Sumerians had always seen the gods as partners in creation, but after Agade's fall, that relationship changed. The divine became distant, unpredictable, sometimes indifferent. Later Babylonian and Assyrian myths would inherit this uncertainty. The gods still ruled, but from afar their motives mysterious. Humanity's place in the cosmos became smaller, its role humbler. The age of intimacy between man and God had ended. There's something profoundly human in that shift. When the gods stopped answering, the people didn't stop speaking. They wrote. The Curse of Agade is, in its own way, an attempt to keep the conversation going. It turns divine silence into narrative. If the gods won't explain themselves, the humans will. That's what myth does. It fills the gap where certainty used to be. The act of telling becomes its own form of worship. The temple walls of Agade, now half ruined, must have echoed with that same stubborn faith. Even as dust settled on the altars, even as statues cracked and idols were carried away, someone stayed behind to record their leaving. Perhaps a young priest, perhaps an old one too tired to travel. He would have walked through the empty halls, past the overturned offering tables, and felt the strange quiet where music once filled the air. The wind moving through the open doors might have sounded like breath, the last trace of the divine lingering in absence. We like to think of the gods as eternal, but the truth is they live only as long as people remember them. In that sense, the gods of Agade didn't disappear completely. They moved into language. They became words pressed into clay, names recited in laments. When archaeologists later found those tablets, they weren't resurrecting forgotten deities. They were uncovering the very process of forgetting. That's what gives this story its endurance. The gods left their temples, but they didn't vanish. They changed form. They became the echo of faith itself, the memory of presence within absence. The people who once offered bread and beer now offered stories, and those stories proved stronger than stone. The ziggurats crumbled, but the idea of gods, capricious, silent, human-like in their distance, spread across cultures, shaping the divine for thousands of years to come. When you read the words, "the gods left their cities," it's easy to imagine loss, but there's also a strange peace in it. It marks the moment when humanity learned to speak without expecting an answer. That silence became the space where reflection began, where history and faith parted ways. The people of Agade may have watched their gods vanish into the horizon, but they also discovered that memory could hold what stone and ritual could not. The night after their departure, the temples must have glowed faintly with the last light of oil lamps. The priests would have extinguished them one by one, leaving the city in darkness for the first time. Outside, the stars hung low and unblinking, cold and clear. Somewhere in that stillness, a scribe picked up his stylus, shaped a new tablet, and began again. "The gods have left their temples, the city waits." That line, though never written exactly that way, lives inside all the others. It is the essence of the curse, the moment when the sacred world stepped back, and the human one began to understand itself. The gods were gone, but the story was not, and in that story they still lingered, silent, patient, eternal in absence. By the time the gods were said to have left their temples, the city was already unraveling. The fall of Agade did not come with fire from the sky or a single night of ruin. It came like erosion. Each season stripped something away. Each year carved the city smaller. The granaries, once full, began to echo. The canals filled with dust. The great ziggurat, built to bridge earth and heaven, loomed over a people who no longer looked up. Collapse doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. The records that survive from those last years speak softly, as if the scribes themselves were running out of the words. The lists of rations shrink to fractions. Workers vanish from the rolls. Temples list their offerings not in abundance, but in apology. Half a lamb instead of 2, a handful of barley where once there were baskets. The tone of the tablets changes from command to plea. "Let the king be blessed," one fragment says. "Let the river rise again." Beneath the bureaucracy lies despair. In the story told later, the collapse came as divine retribution. Enlil, offended by Naram-Sin's arrogance, unleashed destruction upon the city through the Gutians, a people from the mountain lands to the east. They came like locusts, the poem says. They filled the plain with bodies. But history is less theatrical. The Gutians didn't descend as a divine army. They moved into a vacuum. The empire's defences had thinned, the outer provinces had already broken away. When the mountains emptied their restless tribes, the plains were too weak to resist. The war that once carried the empire's banners now came home, quieter, meaner, closer. Archaeological layers tell their own version. Burn marks, broken walls, signs of hurried abandonment. In some sites, skeletons are found amid collapsed roofs, suggesting sudden violence. But in most, the ruins are simply empty. The people left before the worst came, carrying what they could: water jars, tools, idols wrapped in cloth. They followed the receding rivers north or west, seeking new land, new rulers, or simply survival. The empire dissolved not in conquest, but in migration. For those who remained, the end was slower and more intimate. The palace, once the centre of power, became a shell. Guards deserted their posts. Servants stopped coming. Naram-Sin himself fades from the tablets after a point, replaced by confusion, contradictory reigns, missing names. The administrative machine that had defined the empire simply stopped. In later generations, the king's death would become mythic, the cursed monarch who watched his city die as punishment for his pride. The reality was probably less poetic, but no less tragic. He may have died in battle or sickness or exile. The difference didn't matter. What mattered was that no one replaced him with certainty. When the king disappeared, the empire's identity went with him. In a society built on divine favour, a silent throne was unbearable. Without a king, there was no axis for prayer, no conduit between heaven and earth. The temples that remained began to serve themselves, each city turning inward, each god now sovereign in isolation. Agade, once the heart that tied all others together, became an empty vessel. The curse had fulfilled itself, not through wrath, but through disconnection. The poem, The Curse of Agade, captures this with eerie simplicity. Its walls were torn, its gates were thrown open, its streets were deserted. Dogs and snakes walked where kings once feasted. The language is not embellished, it's resigned. The world that once seemed eternal had turned feral. The civilization that had tamed nature was now reclaimed by it. Dust drifted through open doorways. Grass pushed up through cracks in the bricks. The hum of trade was replaced by the whisper of wind through reeds. Imagine walking through the city in those last days. The air hangs heavy, the horizon dim with dust. The great market square is empty except for overturned baskets and a few figures moving quickly, avoiding one another. The statues of the gods still stand in the temples, but their eyes are dull with grit. The smell of stale grain lingers in storerooms where no one counts the harvest anymore. Somewhere a potter's kiln has gone cold, its last half-fired vessels sitting untouched. The sound of sandals on baked earth echoes where once there was a chorus of voices. At night the silence deepens. The stars, once guides for priests reading omens, shine cold and indifferent. The ziggurat stands against the sky like a mountain built for a god who no longer visits. Perhaps a few priests still climb its steps out of habit, lighting lamps that flicker in the wind. But even they must have known the truth. The lamps were no longer signals to heaven. They were memorials. When the Gutians finally arrived, there was almost nothing left to take. The city that had fed half the world could not feed itself. The conquerors occupied ruins. They looted what remained of the temples, broke the idols for their gold, and moved on. The invaders didn't need to destroy Agade. Time had already done it for them. What remained was a name spoken in fear and superstition, a place people avoided. To walk among its ruins was to invite the curse, and yet even ruin has its beauty. In the centuries that followed, new cities rose on the old plains, Babylon, Assur, Ur. Each of them looked back at Agade as a warning and a legend. They told the story of the proud king who angered the gods, the city abandoned by its divine patrons. They sang its downfall not to mock it, but to remember what power costs. Every new empire in Mesopotamia carried a shadow shaped like Agade. Every victory was haunted by its silence. From a modern view, what happened to Agade seems inevitable. A long drought, political overreach, environmental exhaustion, the natural cycle of rise and fall. But to those who lived it, it was unthinkable. They had believed in the permanence of their walls, in the fairness of their gods, in the rhythm of the rivers. To watch all of that fail at once must have felt like the unraveling of reality itself. Civilization depends on the illusion of control, and Agade was the first to learn how fragile that illusion can be. Even as the city died, the scribes kept their vigil. They pressed the story into clay, recording not just the fall, but the feeling of it, the confusion, the guilt, the wonder that something so vast could vanish. Agade is no more, one lament says, its people are scattered like starlight. And yet, by writing those words, they ensured it would never truly vanish. If you were to stand today where Agade once stood, you would see nothing of its towers or gates. The rivers have long changed course. The dust has reclaimed the outlines. The wind carries only fragments, a brick here, a shard of pottery there. But beneath that surface lies the memory of an entire world waiting in silence. The curse promised that no king would rebuild it, and none ever did. Perhaps that's why it still endures. In absence, it remains perfect. The fall of Agade wasn't only the fall of a city, it was the first realization that civilization itself is mortal. Every empire since has written its own version of that story, changing the names, the gods, the rivers, but never the lesson. The end always comes quietly, long before anyone calls it an end. And so the wind moves across the empty plain, shaping patterns in the dust where streets once ran. The same sun that once glinted off silver and grain now burns on bare earth. Somewhere, in the imagination of time, a scribe finishes his last tablet, sets down his stylus, and looks toward the horizon. The city that once dreamed of heaven has turned to shadow, but the story remains, unbroken, waiting to be told again. Long after Agade had turned to dust, long after its ziggurat was swallowed by the earth and the wind erased its streets, its voice remained, buried in clay. The people were gone, the temples empty, but the tablets stayed, patient and silent, waiting under layers of soil for the world to return to listening. They had no breath, no sound, yet they carried memory. When time finally uncovered them, their words still knew how to speak. For centuries, the location of Agade was forgotten. The name itself seemed almost mythical, a ghost city that existed only in the laments of later kings. But even myths leave traces. The tablets that survived from other cities still mentioned Agade with reverence and fear. "May I never become like Agade," one ancient prayer says. "May my God never abandon me as Enlil abandoned her." In those few words you can hear how completely the story of its fall had become a warning, a wound retold so often that it turned into instruction. The people of later empires didn't remember its streets or its walls. They remembered the silence that followed them. When archaeologists began to unearth the cities of Mesopotamia in the 19th century, they found that silence literally embedded in the ground. Shards of pottery, fragments of tablets, layers of burnt brick, all speaking the same forgotten language. Among the ruins of Nippur, and Kish, they began to find copies of the Curse of Agade. Not one copy, but many, copied and recopied across centuries. Each scribe had pressed the same lament into clay, preserving a story that had already outlived its city. To hold one of those tablets is to hold the ghost of a voice, a human attempt to make sense of loss before words like history or collapse existed. The clay remembers differently than the mind does. It doesn't embellish. It doesn't mourn. It simply endures. A wedge pressed by a stylus 4,000 years ago can still be read today, its edges crisp enough to catch light. The language that once sounded through courtyards and markets now sits beneath glass in museums, its meaning returned to the world through translation. But reading those words now isn't the same as hearing them then. The tablets were written to be recited aloud, their rhythm meant to echo through temple halls. In their day, the lines of the Curse of Agade weren't just literature, they were ritual. Each repetition was an act of memory, each lament a reminder that forgetting was the real death. When scholars first translated the text, they were struck by how modern it felt. It doesn't celebrate victory or praise kings. It speaks of loss, guilt, and human fragility. It wonders why divine favour turns to silence. It questions power. In a world still struggling with the same questions, how much control do we truly have? What happens when nature stops obeying? What makes civilization endure? It feels less like an artifact and more like a mirror. Even in translation, the voice of the scribes is intimate. "The rivers ceased their speech," one line reads. "The fields forgot their children." In a single sentence, a natural disaster becomes personal, emotional. That's the genius of the Sumerian worldview. It never separated the world from the self. When the earth suffered, so did the soul. When the gods withdrew, it wasn't theology, it was loneliness. Every line of the curse carries that ache. The tablets also whisper something subtler, something that goes beyond the story of Agade. They reveal how early humanity began to see history not as fate, but as cause and effect. The curse doesn't describe random chaos. It offers a sequence, a chain of choices and consequences. The king's arrogance leads to divine anger. Divine anger leads to drought. Drought leads to hunger. Hunger leads to ruin. It's morality woven into observation. Beneath the religious framework lies the first flicker of reason, the attempt to explain collapse not as mystery, but as pattern. That same impulse defines archaeology itself. The scholars who uncovered those tablets were, in their own way, descendants of the scribes, people compelled to rescue meaning from dust. They too worked with silence. Each excavation, each translation, was an echo reaching across time, one mind recognizing another. When they pieced together the broken tablets, they weren't only reconstructing sentences, they were restoring memory to the world. Some of those tablets are incomplete, the lines ending mid-thought where the clay is broken. The missing words are perhaps the most haunting part. They remind us that memory is always partial, that history arrives with gaps no one can fill. Yet even those gaps speak. They tell us that Agade existed, that people cared enough to mourn it, that loss was powerful enough to demand writing. The fragments are proof of continuity, not of empire, but of empathy. If you could stand in the rooms where those tablets were written, you'd hear a sound that no longer exists, the soft tap of stylus on clay, the murmur of voices reading back each line to ensure the rhythm was right. You'd smell the mixture of river mud and straw used to make the tablets, feel the weight of them drying in the sun. The air would be thick with heat, but the scribes worked steadily, their eyes focused, their hands moving with ritual precision. They were not writing for fame or posterity. They were writing because they had to, because silence needed form. Thousands of years later, when one of those tablets was first read again, the effect was strangely intimate. Across 4 millennia, the words still carried emotion. The translator's voice cracked as he spoke them aloud. It wasn't the grandeur of the empire that reached him, it was the humanity of its sorrow. To read the curse is to stand beside those ancient writers and feel what they felt. Confusion, guilt, grief, awe. The clay may be cold, but the words still burn quietly inside it. In a way, the Curse of Agade did what no temple could. It made the gods mortal and memory eternal. It preserved what even stone couldn't. And in doing so, it created something entirely new. The idea that a story can outlast its world. That is the whisper inside the clay. Not just that Agade fell, but that meaning can survive even when belief doesn't. Every civilization leaves behind its own kind of clay. For some, it's paper. For others, data, monuments, or music. But the impulse is the same, to leave behind a record that says, we were here, we thought, we tried to understand. The tablets of Agade are that message written in its earliest form. They are the first whisper from humanity to itself. When you look at one of those tablets today, cracked and worn, it's easy to forget what you're really seeing. You're not just looking at writing, you're looking at endurance. The physical survival of thought, carried across time not by strength, but by fragility. The clay is simple, the marks crude, yet they hold a universe. Each wedge is a heartbeat, each line a breath stolen from an age that refused to die quietly. Agade fell, but its language did not. Its story lay sleeping in the earth until the world learned how to listen again. And now, each time the tablets are read, the silence that once swallowed the city becomes a voice once more. The wind that drifts over its forgotten plain carries that voice still, soft, persistent, whispering through the dust, reminding us that memory, once written, never truly ends. The curse was written as divine punishment, but buried beneath its poetry lies something more tangible, something that science, thousands of years later, would uncover grain by grain. For all its gods and laments, the Curse of Agade might be the oldest eyewitness account of climate collapse. What the ancients described as divine anger, we now recognise as the earth changing its rhythm, the rivers altering their course, the atmosphere turning against its own creations. The gods may have been metaphors, but the catastrophe they embodied was real. For centuries the story was myth, until the ground began to confirm it. Archaeologists, geologists and climate scientists have since pieced together the silent evidence that the scribes couldn't name but clearly felt. Cores drilled deep into the plains of Mesopotamia tell of a sudden shift around 2200 BCE, a period now known as the 4.2 kilo-year event. It wasn't a single drought or a brief famine. It was a global pattern of desiccation, a century-long drying that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. The very climate that had made the great river civilizations possible began to falter. The soil holds the story better than any myth. In layers once rich with silt and organic residue, scientists found a band of fine dust, a geological pause, the Earth's version of silence. It corresponds perfectly with the time of Agade's decline. The rivers that once flooded predictably began to shrink. Irrigation systems built for abundance now delivered poison as evaporating water left behind layers of salt. Harvests failed. Populations moved. Cities contracted, not because of war, but because the environment itself withdrew its permission for civilization. In that light, the curse becomes a coded record of environmental feedback. When the scribes wrote that Enlil turned his face away, they were describing the failure of natural cycles that their entire worldview depended on. In Mesopotamia, religion and ecology were inseparable. The gods were not beings above nature, they were nature. Adad was the rain, Enki the water, Shamash the sun, Ishtar the fertility of the land. To anger the gods was to upset the natural balance. To lose their favour was to lose the world. That worldview, while mythic in form, carried an intuitive understanding of interdependence that modern science only rephrases. They saw collapse as moral, we see it as systemic, but the recognition is the same. Nothing breaks alone. When the climate shifted, it didn't just ruin crops, it dismantled trade, trust, and belief. The economy, the religion, the politics, all began to collapse together because they were the same thing. The Curse of Agade, in that sense, is not superstition. It is observation translated into myth. In recent decades, studies of ancient pollen grains from northern Mesopotamia have shown a clear pattern of desertification. Grasses vanish from the record, replaced by weeds and dust particles carried by wind. At the same time, the skeletons of livestock in nearby settlements show signs of starvation. Thin bone structure, slowed growth. Even pottery tells the story. The shapes of jars change, built smaller and simpler, reflecting scarcity. Every fragment of evidence aligns with the same quiet disaster the Sumerians called divine withdrawal. The connection extends far beyond Mesopotamia. Around the same century, the Egyptian Old Kingdom suffered its own collapse, marked by failed Nile floods. The Indus Valley cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro began to empty. The Amorites and the Gutians, once mountain tribes, migrated into the fertile plains drawn by survival, not conquest. Across continents, the same slow hunger rippled outward. What the ancients saw as the wrath of gods may have been the earth responding to a global shift in weather patterns, a change so gradual it must have felt eternal. For the people of Agade, there were no scientific explanations. There were only signs. A dry riverbed was an omen. A dying field was a warning. They read the world the way we read data. They counted what they could observe and filled the rest with meaning. That meaning, the curse, became a survival mechanism. It gave chaos a reason, suffering a purpose. In the absence of science, myth became an early form of ecology, describing balance and consequence in the only language they had. It's easy to underestimate how perceptive those early observers were. They noticed the slight changes that preceded disaster. The shorter floods, the different winds, the taste of salt in water drawn from wells. Their response wasn't ignorance, it was reverence. They built rituals to maintain the balance, not because they were foolish, but because they understood, in their own way, how fragile that balance was. To them, divine favour was another word for stability. And when that stability vanished, when their careful offerings could not bring back the rain, they concluded that something beyond human repair had broken. If we strip away the theology, the Curse of Agade becomes an ancient environmental record written in emotional code. Its moral language, pride, sin, punishment, translates easily into modern terms: overreach, exploitation, collapse. The empire expanded faster than its resources, demanded more from the land than it could give, ignored early signs of strain. What the Sumerians expressed as hubris toward the gods, we might call ecological arrogance. The parallel is almost too clear. Their droughts were our droughts in slow motion. There's a haunting symmetry in the fact that modern satellites now trace the same land the Sumerians once irrigated. The outlines of ancient canals are still visible from space, ghost paths of vanished water. They look like veins under skin, reminders of a civilization that tried to rewrite geography and was undone by it. The Earth, indifferent and cyclical, reclaimed what was borrowed. To the people who lived there, that reclamation was divine justice. To us, it is climate feedback. Either way, the message is the same. Even the god's silence, as described in the tablets, has its scientific counterpart. When prolonged drought stripped moisture from the land, the winds changed pattern, muffling sound, altering the very atmosphere. The air itself would have felt different, heavier, drier, resistant. To people who believed communication with the divine depended on ritual sound, that atmospheric stillness would have felt like cosmic quiet. The silence of the gods may have been literal. The precision of modern data does not replace the power of ancient perception. It deepens it. Every dust layer, every fossilized seed, every isotopic shift confirms that the people of Agade weren't imagining their catastrophe. They lived through one of the first large-scale climate disasters in recorded history, and their response was to mythologize it, to preserve it as warning. In that way, the Curse of Agade isn't just history, it's continuity. It's the earliest articulation of a pattern that has repeated ever since. Expansion, imbalance, collapse, memory. The most remarkable part is that those scribes, without knowing the science, understood the pattern better than many who came after them. They didn't separate morality from survival. To them, the health of the land was the measure of human virtue. They believed arrogance toward the divine, toward balance itself, would bring ruin. In our terms, they understood sustainability long before we named it. If you read the Curse of Agade now, knowing the data behind it, the lines gain new layers. The sky withheld its rain. The earth refused its grain. Those aren't just verses, they're climate notes. The gods' withdrawing was nature recalibrating. The people's repentance was adaptation. The lament was documentation. The tablets became the bridge between emotion and evidence, between myth and data. In the end, science doesn't debunk the curse, it fulfills it. It gives form to what the scribes could only sense. The droughts they called divine wrath were real. The hunger they described left traces in bones and soil. The silence of their gods was the silence of the wind over a dying plain. They told the truth, just in a different language. The story of Agade has become more than legend because it captures both sides of truth, the human and the natural. One side wrote of gods and curses, the other, thousands of years later, writes of isotopes and sediment. Both describe the same collapse, and both carry the same message. When we push too far against the balance that sustains us, the world responds, not in anger, but in consequence. The dust that once buried Agade still drifts across Mesopotamia, caught in every wind that passes over its forgotten plain. Each grain is a remnant of that long drought, a particle of time that outlived its empire. The curse, the science, the story, they're all the same echo, whispered through clay and wind and memory, reminding us that even the gods, whatever names we give them, still live in the cycles of the earth. When a civilization dies, it doesn't vanish. It changes shape. Its walls crumble, its rulers fade, its temples are buried, but its language, its symbols, its ideas, all drift onward like dust caught in a high wind. Agade may have fallen, its name reduced to a curse whispered by later kings, but its spirit didn't end there. The world it created, its way of writing, its way of ruling, its way of remembering, became the foundation upon which every later empire in Mesopotamia would quietly stand. The people who fled Agade didn't disappear into the wilderness. They carried their knowledge with them, how to measure time by the stars, how to record thought in clay, how to build cities around belief. Even as their gods fell silent, their habits of creation survived. The refugees who once prayed in the shadow of the great ziggurat settled in new lands, some in the south, rebuilding in the marshes near Ur and Eridu, others to the north where the Tigris still ran. Wherever they went, they brought fragments of their lost world. Within a few generations, those fragments began to grow again. Archaeology shows this transformation clearly. After Agade's collapse, there's a brief emptiness in the record, a thinning of settlements, a silence in the soil. Then, slowly, life returns. Small villages appear. New trade routes form. Pottery changes shape. Not crude, but simplified, as if society was rebuilding itself from the ground up. In time, from those small beginnings, new powers emerged. The cities of Ur and Lagash revived, and from their scribes came new kings, new hymns, new stories. Out of Agade's ashes rose the next chapter of Mesopotamian civilization. The kings who followed understood the lesson of Agade, or thought they did. They still called on the same gods, Enlil, Ishtar, Shamash, but with a note of humility. The inscriptions of Ur's rulers, written just a few generations later, echo with caution. They speak of devotion, obedience, restraint. "I built this temple by the command of Enlil," one reads, "that he might never turn his face from me." The fear of divine withdrawal had become the moral foundation of empire. The memory of Agade was now theology. Yet even as they built anew, they borrowed from what had come before. The administrative systems that once managed Agade's grain reappeared in the records of Ur. The Akkadian language survived, mingling with Sumerian, eventually becoming the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. The very script that once chronicled the curse now served to praise new kings. The empire may have died, but its infrastructure, its mental architecture, lived on, quietly reshaping everything that came after. That continuity is one of the strange ironies of history. What the ancients called destruction was, in a longer view, transformation. The fall of Agade didn't end civilization, it decentralized it. The unity that had once stretched from the mountains to the Gulf broke into smaller, more resilient parts. Where once there was one great capital, now there were many. Each city became its own world again, drawing strength from local gods, local rivers, local soil. The grand experiment of empire dissolved back into its elements, and in that scattering lay renewal. The storytellers of later ages couldn't help but mythologize this process. To them, Agade's fall was both tragedy and purification. It was the moment humanity was reminded that greatness without reverence leads to ruin. In the hymns of the Earth Third period, the gods returned to their cities, their temples restored, their altars relit. But the tone has changed. The new kings don't claim divinity. They call themselves shepherds. Power becomes stewardship, not ownership. You can hear in those lines the echo of Naram-Sin's mistake, the shadow of a ruler who once dreamed of heaven and found only silence. Still, the longing for order, for empire, for something as vast as Agade never disappeared. Centuries later, Babylon would rise on the same plains, borrowing the same gods, the same calendar, even the same flood myths. The old words were reused, the old laments resung. In Babylon's great libraries, scribes continued to copy the Curse of Agade, keeping its memory alive as a lesson and a warning. When Hammurabi wrote his laws, the Akkadian phrases of his code still carried the linguistic DNA of Agade. Even in exile, the city's language had become the grammar of civilization itself. It's tempting to think of history as linear, one empire replacing another, but in Mesopotamia, it was cyclical. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all were inheritors of the same story told in different tongues. Each age remembered Agade differently. To some, it was a real city cursed for arrogance. To others, it was a symbol of human fragility, the reminder that even kings answer to something larger. To us, it's both. A place that existed, and an idea that refuses to die. When archaeologists finally read the tablets, they discovered that the curse was not just an ending, it was an act of survival. By turning catastrophe into story, the scribes preserved their civilization in its purest form, thought. Empires rise and fall, but the ability to remember, to analyse, to tell, that's what continues. The people of Agade may not have known it, but in writing their fall, they guaranteed their immortality. Their city became the first to live twice, once in earth and once in language. If you look at the broader pattern, you see the afterlife of Agade not as an isolated event, but as the beginning of something larger, the birth of historical consciousness. Before, disasters were forgotten, replaced by new reigns and new myths. After Agade, collapse became narrative. People began to ask why. They turned observation into reflection, memory into instruction. Every civilization that followed inherited that habit. The need to explain, to connect consequence to cause, to seek meaning in loss. Even the landscape remembers. The canals that once fed Agade became ghost lines, visible only from the air, but their geometry inspired later engineers. The ruins that melted back into the earth enriched the soil for later builders. The clay that once bore the curse was recycled, mixed into new bricks for temples raised in the names of other kings. The physical city became raw material for new beginnings. The symbolic city became warning and wisdom. And so, Agade lived on, not in glory, but in influence. Its story shaped how later civilizations imagined power, failure, and redemption. It became part of a cultural bloodstream that flowed for thousands of years, long after its name ceased to be spoken aloud. Each time a scribe pressed a stylus into clay, each time a priest recited a lament for a fallen city, the spirit of Agade stirred. Its curse had turned to counsel. If you listen closely, even now, the message is the same. Nothing truly disappears. Every ending leaves a trace. The dust that once covered Agade became the foundation for new cities. The silence that once defined its fall became the voice of history itself. The gods may have left their temples, but the people who remembered them carried the temples in their minds. That is the afterlife of civilization, not stone, not empire, but the endurance of meaning. The plain where Agade once stood is quiet now, the horizon empty except for wind. But beneath that stillness lies continuity. Every civilization since has walked the same path. Creation, expansion, overreach, collapse, renewal. The scribes of Agade were the first to see that pattern clearly, the first to write it down. In doing so, they gave humanity its oldest mirror. When we look into it, we don't just see their ruins, we see ourselves, reflected in clay, still whispering across the millennia. The wind never truly left the plains where Agade once stood. It moves softly now, brushing over the same ground that once echoed with chants and market cries, with the ring of bronze and the hum of prayers rising toward the sun. There is no city anymore, no walls, no tower, no sound of life. But if you listen long enough, there's something else. A hum beneath the silence, like the echo of something that refuses to be forgotten. It isn't a voice exactly. It's the memory of one. The memory of a city that dreamed too high and fell too far, yet somehow outlived itself in words, in myth, in thought. Agade's name survived the ages not because its walls endured, but because its story did. It became an inheritance passed through language, pressed from clay to clay, retold by generations who never saw it. The Sumerians first lamented it, the Babylonians warned against it, the Assyrians studied it, and the scholars of later centuries read it as a riddle left by time. Every empire that followed built in its shadow. Even when the exact place of Agade was lost, the idea of it remained. A phantom city standing for the price of human pride and the fragility of divine favour. The poem that carried its ghost, the Curse of Agade, became more than a story. It became a mirror. It reflected each age that read it. To the Sumerians, it was divine justice. To the Babylonians, it was moral order. To us, it is history itself, a record of how the earliest humans tried to understand the collapse of their world. The fact that it still exists at all, that its words still reach us across 40 centuries, is proof that some memories refuse extinction. They pass beyond the limits of empire and belief, carried by the simple persistence of curiosity. When modern archaeologists began to unearth those clay tablets, they were uncovering more than artifacts. They were uncovering the world's first attempt to rescue meaning from loss. Each wedge pressed into clay by some long-dead hand became a pulse from a vanished age. To hold one is to feel a direct connection to the scribes who once sat in courtyards of dust, shaping their grief into permanence. The words they wrote were not just for their gods or their kings. They were for us, the strangers at the other end of time, still asking the same questions they did. Why do great things fall? Why does silence follow devotion? What endures when everything else disappears? Agade's survival in memory shows how deeply humans resist forgetting. Every civilization since has built monuments to its own endurance, but none of those monuments last forever. Stone breaks, metal corrodes, cities drown in sand. Yet stories, especially those born of catastrophe, find ways to continue. They migrate between tongues, slip between faiths, hide in literature, resurface as metaphors. Agade lived on not just as a historical city, but as a psychological landscape. Its fall became a pattern that every later culture would trace in its own way. The tower that reaches too high, the king who defies the heavens, the flood that erases the proud, these are all echoes of Agade. It's strange how loss can preserve what triumph cannot. Sargon's empire, Naram-Sin's conquests, the riches of the markets, all are gone. But the lament, the grief, the story, that is what endures. Perhaps this is what the scribes understood best. They couldn't save their world, but they could explain it. They could take the ashes and shape them into words that outlasted everything that fire destroyed. That instinct, to remember, to record, to give structure to impermanence, is civilization's true immortality. Even the curse itself changed over time. Later copies softened its edges, turned its gods from vengeful to sorrowful, its king from arrogant to tragic. Memory reshaped myth, and myth reshaped understanding. The more distant Agade became, the more it belonged to everyone. Each retelling made the story less about one city and more about the human condition. The curse evolved into a kind of prayer, not for protection from divine wrath, but for awareness, for humility. In that way, Agade achieved what no empire ever could. It transcended history. It became a reminder, a parable written into the foundation of thought. The first city to dream of ruling the world became the first to teach the world its limits. Every age has had its own Agade, a moment when its reach exceeded its wisdom, when its gods fell silent, when it mistook abundance for eternity. And every age has rediscovered the same truth. Memory is both warning and redemption. Today, the exact spot where Agade stood is still unknown. Archaeologists search the plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates, chasing clues left in stray bricks and buried canals. Somewhere beneath that earth, under the dust of newer ruins, lie the last remnants of the First Empire. But even if no one ever finds them, Agade is already found. It exists wherever its story is told, in every classroom, every library, every moment someone looks at the ruins of another fallen world and wonders how something so vast could disappear. If you stand on those plains now, the air still tastes of dryness, and the light still falls in the same way it did 4,000 years ago. The wind carries the faint hiss of sand shifting across old foundations, the kind of sound that could almost be mistaken for whispering. It's not hard to imagine that whisper saying what the tablets already told us, that nothing built by hands or ruled by pride will last, but what is written, what is truly understood, never dies. And so Agade endures, not as dust or ruin, but as awareness. The first civilization to collapse also became the first to comprehend collapse, to name it, to give it meaning. That is its afterlife. That is its immortality. Every time we read its lament, we resurrect it. Every time we speak its name, we continue the conversation its people began when the gods stopped speaking. The memory that would not die lives not in the earth, but in us, in the part of the human mind that insists on asking why the world changes, why glory fades, and why we keep building anyway. That same impulse that drove the scribes to press words into clay drives us still. It is the inheritance Agade left behind, the belief that memory can outlast ruin, that understanding can turn loss into continuity. The plains are quiet now. The stars rise over the same horizon the priests once watched for signs. There are no temples left to light their way. Yet in the stillness, Agade remains, eternal, unseen, alive in the silence it once feared. The curse has turned to echo, the echo to story, and the story to memory. And the memory, patient as clay, will not die.